Hey there, weirdos! I'm back after facing so many struggles. I've been watching the World Cup games and gigging around a lot. Thanks for sticking around. So I made 3 videos about weird bands. That was almost 100 bands. Now I've decided to make one about the weirdest songs out there. There's some really bizarre stuff. Some are extremely experimental, and others are just plain bizarre. Let's get to the first one. The Ostrich. The Ostrich is a garage rock song released in 1964 under the name The Primitives, a group created for a studio recording led by Lou Reed. Although it began as a low-budget label commission meant to capitalize on the dance crazes of the era, it later became an important piece in the history of experimental rock. The song introduced ideas that Reed would develop more fully, shortly afterward with the Velvet Underground. Context. At the time, Lou Reed was working as a staff songwriter for Pickwick Records, quickly producing songs for budget releases and disposable studio projects. The Ostrich was written to promote a fictional dance, parodying the wave of dance-crazed songs that dominated the early 1960s. Even though it was a commercial assignment, Reed used it as an opportunity to experiment with unconventional sounds. Sound and innovation. The recording's most distinctive feature is the so-called ostrich tuning, in which all the guitar strings are tuned to the same note. Instead of traditional chords, the instrument produces a continuous drone, creating a hypnotic, repetitive effect. This approach caught the attention of John Cale, whose background in avant-garde music resonated with these textures. Soon afterward, Reed and Cale would form the core of the Velvet Underground, Legacy. Although it was not a commercial hit, the Ostrich is now regarded as one of the early seeds of experimental rock. The recording anticipated the use of drones, repetition, and minimalism that would define the first Velvet Underground albums and later influence generations of musicians in alternative rock, krautrock, and noise music. What makes this song strange? Instead of relying on conventional chord progressions, the Ostrich is built around a single repeated pitch across all the guitar strings. That seemingly simple idea creates a hypnotic sound that was highly unusual for a rock record in 1964 and helped open the door to a new way of thinking about the electric guitar.
Alright, everybody get down on your face, man. Get ready, yeah. Okay, come on. Hey, you put your hands up, upside your knees, now really off there. Yeah, take this forward, step on your head.
Jesus' Blood Never Failed Me Yet. Jesus' Blood Never Failed Me Yet is a minimalist composition created in 1971 by Gavin Bryars, built around a short recording of an unidentified homeless man singing a religious hymn. It has become one of Bryars' best-known works for transforming a simple documentary recording into a deeply contemplative and emotionally powerful musical experience. Context. Bryars discovered the recording while working on the soundtrack for a documentary about homeless people in the London districts of Elephant and Castle and Waterloo. Although the excerpt was never used in the film, he noticed that the singer's pitch naturally matched the piano. He developed the entire composition from that 13-bar phrase. Bryars later recalled leaving the tape playing in an art studio, where several people became visibly moved, convincing him of the recording's remarkable emotional power, sound, and innovation. The piece begins with nothing more than the man's fragile voice, repeated in a continuous loop. Over time, strings, brass, and other instruments gradually enter, creating an increasingly rich orchestral texture while leaving the original melody completely unchanged. Rather than treating the recording as a sample to be manipulated, Bryars builds the entire composition around it, allowing the anonymous singer to remain at the center throughout. Legacy. Originally lasting around 25 minutes, the work was later expanded into 60 and 74-minute versions. The 1993 recording became especially well known for featuring Tom Waits, whose voice gradually joins the anonymous singer in the closing sections. The piece has inspired choreographies, performances by other musicians, and even a 12-hour presentation at Tate Modern, cementing its status as one of the defining works of minimalist and experimental music.
Never found me yet. this one thing I know.
Frankie Teardrop. Frankie Teardrop is a song by the American duo Suicide, released on their self-titled debut album in 1977. Lasting nearly 10 minutes, it is widely regarded as one of the most disturbing recordings in experimental rock, combining a minimalist electronic backdrop with Alan Vega's emotionally intense vocal performance. Over the decades, it has become one of the band's defining works and a landmark of proto-punk. Context: Suicide emerged in New York during the mid-1970s with a radically unconventional sound. While punk bands relied on guitars, bass, and drums, Suicide performed using only Martin Rev's primitive synthesizers and drum machines alongside Alan Vega's vocals. Frankie Teardrop reflected the duo's desire to strip rock music to its bare essentials, while creating an atmosphere of overwhelming psychological tension, sound, and innovation. The song is built around a relentless drum machine pattern and repetitive synthesizer figures that barely change throughout its duration. Instead of introducing musical variation, the tension comes from Alan Vega's increasingly desperate vocal delivery, ranging from whispered narration to piercing screams. The combination of extreme minimalism and emotional intensity creates a hypnotic experience, unlike almost anything else released in the 1970s. Legacy. Initially divisive, Frankie Teardrop has since become one of the most influential recordings in experimental rock. Its minimalist approach helped shape industrial music, post-punk, synth-punk, and noise rock, while its uncompromising atmosphere continues to make it a reference point for artists exploring psychological tension through sound. It remains one of the most unsettling and frequently discussed songs ever recorded.
Frankie Teardrop.
Caledonia. Caledonia is a track by the American experimental rock band Cro-Magnon, released in 1969 on their only album, Orgasm. Combining Scottish bagpipes, tribal percussion, distorted screams, and electronic manipulation, it is widely regarded as one of the most unconventional recordings of the psychedelic era and a remarkable precursor to industrial and noise music. Context: Cro-Magnon was a short-lived New York collective that rejected the conventions of late 1960s rock. Rather than focusing on melodies or extended guitar solos, the group experimented with primitive rhythms, tape manipulation, and unconventional sound sources. Caledonia became the album's most recognizable piece because of its radical approach to composition and production, sound, and innovation. The track opens with traditional Scottish bagpipes before abruptly shifting into pounding tribal drums, distorted vocal screams, metallic percussion, and layers of electronic effects. Instead of following a conventional verse and chorus structure, Caledonia unfolds as a chaotic sequence of contrasting sonic textures. The combination of folk instruments with aggressive noise was virtually unprecedented in rock music at the time, and anticipated techniques that would later appear in industrial, noise rock, and experimental music. Legacy. Although Orgasm received little attention upon its original release, it gradually became a cult favorite among collectors and experimental musicians. Caledonia is now frequently cited as one of the earliest examples of rock embracing pure sonic experimentation, and its influence can be heard in later industrial, noise, and avant-garde artists. More than 5 decades later, it remains one of the most startling recordings of the psychedelic underground. The American Metaphysical Circus. The American Metaphysical Circus is a track by the United States of America, released in 1968 as the opening piece of their self-titled album. It is widely regarded as one of the most unusual fusion experiments of late 1960s rock, combining political satire, orchestral collage, early electronic processing, and fragmented pop structure into a single composition. Context: the United States of America was a short-lived experimental rock group formed in New York, led by Joseph Bird and Dorothy Moskowitz. The project emerged from an avant-garde background influenced by academic composition, tape music, and political art. The album was recorded during a period when rock music was rapidly absorbing new studio techniques, but few artists were pushing them this far in a single direction: sound and innovation. The track opens with overlapping marching band motifs, quickly dissolving into layered tape loops, distorted vocals, and electronic textures. Instead of a stable rhythm or traditional song form, it shifts through contrasting sonic blocks that feel like disconnected performances stitched together. The result is a controlled form of chaos, where acoustic instruments, early synthesizer techniques, and studio manipulation coexist in constant instability. Legacy. Although the band dissolved shortly after their debut, the American Metaphysical Circus became a reference point for later experimental rock and art pop. Its use of collage structure and electronic processing anticipated techniques that would later appear in krautrock, post-punk production, and avant-garde pop. Today it is considered one of the earliest examples of rock music treating the studio itself as a compositional instrument. Hamburger Lady. Hamburger Lady is a track by the British industrial music group Throbbing Gristle, released in 1978 on the album DOA, The Third and Final Report. Built around a haunting electronic backdrop and an unsettling spoken vocal performance, it is widely regarded as one of the most disturbing and influential recordings in the history of industrial music. Context: Throbbing Gristle emerged in the late 1970s as pioneers of industrial music, rejecting traditional rock in favor of synthesizers, tape manipulation, noise, and provocative subject matter. Hamburger Lady was inspired by a medical report describing the treatment of a severely burned patient. Rather than dramatizing the story, the band adopted a detached clinical tone, making the piece even more unsettling. Sound and innovation. The track is built around a slow synthesizer pulse, eerie electronic drones, and Genesis P. Orridge's restrained spoken narration. Instead of using melody or conventional song structure, it relies on repetition, silence, and subtle sonic changes to create an overwhelming sense of unease. The combination of minimal electronic textures and documentary-like narration was unlike almost anything being recorded at the time, and became a defining characteristic of early industrial music. Legacy. Although never intended for mainstream audiences, Hamburger Lady became one of Throbbing Gristle's best-known recordings and a landmark of industrial music. Its influence can be heard in industrial, dark ambient, noise, and experimental electronic artists who embraced minimalism, psychological tension, and the use of non-traditional subject matter. Nearly 5 decades after its release, it remains one of the most unsettling recordings ever made.
An old favourite we hope you'll enjoy. Hamburger Lady.
Paralyzed. Paralyzed is a song by the legendary Stardust Cowboy, released as a single in 1968. Combining frantic vocals, chaotic guitar playing, relentless drumming, and an unconventional song structure, it has become one of the most unusual recordings in the history of outsider music. Although it received little attention upon its original release, the song later gained cult status for its raw energy and complete disregard for conventional musical standards. Context: the legendary Stardust Cowboy, born Norman Carl O'Dam, recorded Paralyzed in a single session with a small group of studio musicians. Rather than following the polished production common in late 1960s rock, the recording embraced spontaneity and unpredictability. Its bizarre sound made it difficult to classify, placing it somewhere between rockabilly, garage rock, country, and pure musical chaos. Sound and innovation. The song is driven by shouted vocals, deliberately unrestrained guitar playing, pounding drums, and abrupt changes in intensity. Instead of aiming for technical precision, every element feels on the verge of falling apart while somehow remaining together. This raw, almost accidental form of expression gave the recording an intensity unlike anything else released at the time, and anticipated elements later associated with punk rock, noise rock, and outsider music. Legacy. Although Paralyzed was largely ignored upon release, it gradually became a cult classic among collectors and experimental musicians. The song was admired by artists including David Bowie, who took inspiration from the singer's stage name when creating the persona of Ziggy Stardust. Today, Paralyzed is widely regarded as one of the earliest and most influential examples of outsider rock, celebrated for its uncompromising originality and enduring cult reputation.
I'm going to do a song I wrote back in the spring of 1965. It's on my Rocket of Stardom album. That's available on Virgin Records right here in Utrecht at your nearest neighborhood record store. Goes a little something like this. Oh, yeah, the girl! We're ourselves! Paralyzed! Woo!
Quem Sou Eu? Quem Sou Eu is a track by Brazilian musician Pedro Santos, released in 1968 on the album Krishnanda. Combining handmade instruments, unconventional percussion, vocalizations, and sounds produced with everyday objects, it is regarded as one of the most original recordings in Brazilian experimental music. Rather than following the conventions of popular music, the piece creates its own musical language through rhythm, texture, and timbre. Context. Pedro Santos was a self-taught, multi-instrumentalist, inventor, and composer who built many of his own instruments from bamboo, wood, metal, gourds, and found objects. While Brazilian popular music in the late 1960s was embracing psychedelic rock and tropicalismo, Santos followed a completely independent path, drawing inspiration from folk traditions, nature, and spontaneous sound experimentation. Krishnanda became his only solo album, and later earned cult status among collectors and experimental musicians. Sound and innovation. The track blends handmade percussion, water sounds, wooden instruments, whistles, vocal chants, and unusual rhythmic patterns into a constantly shifting sonic landscape. Instead of relying on melody or traditional song structure, Quem Sou Eu emphasizes texture, repetition, and the natural resonance of acoustic objects. The result feels both primitive and forward-looking, anticipating later developments in experimental percussion, world music, and sound art. Legacy. Although Krishnanda received little attention when it was first released, it was rediscovered decades later and is now considered a landmark of Brazilian experimental music. Pedro Santos has since been recognized as one of Brazil's most original musical innovators, and Quem Sou Eu remains a striking example of how unconventional instruments and organic sounds can be transformed into a completely distinct musical language. Symphonie pour un homme seul. Symphonie pour un homme seul is a pioneering work of musique concrète created in 1950 by Pierre Schaeffer and Pierre Henry. Built entirely from manipulated recordings of the human body, spoken fragments, footsteps, breathing, and piano sounds, it is considered one of the foundational works of electronic and experimental music. Context. The piece emerged from Schaeffer's work at the Groupe de Recherche de Musique Concrète in post-war France, where composers were beginning to explore recorded sound as raw material for composition. Instead of writing for traditional orchestral instruments, Schaeffer and Henry assembled and transformed recorded audio using early tape techniques, creating music directly from sound objects rather than musical notation. Sound and innovation. Symphonie pour un homme seul is constructed from short, repeated sound fragments that are cut, reversed, slowed down, and reorganized into rhythmic and textural structures. Human sounds such as breathing, speech patterns, footsteps, and vocal exclamations are treated as musical elements rather than expressive language. The result is a fragmented sonic environment that abandons melody and harmony in favor of rhythm, texture, and timbre. This approach effectively established many of the principles that would later define sampling, electronic music, and sound art. Legacy. The work is widely regarded as one of the earliest and most important examples of musique concrète. Its techniques influenced generations of composers and electronic musicians, from early tape experimenters to modern digital sampling culture. Symphonie pour un homme seul helped redefine music as organized sound rather than traditional musical structure, marking a decisive shift in 20th century composition. Demolition. Demolition is a song by the Peruvian garage rock band Los Circus, released in 1965 as a single. It is widely considered one of the most aggressive and primitive recordings of the 1960s, standing out for its raw energy, minimal structure, and vocal delivery that breaks away from the polished conventions of its era. Context. Los Circus were formed in Lima, Peru, during a period when rock music in Latin America was still heavily influenced by imported British and American styles. Unlike most of their contemporaries, the band developed an extremely raw approach to performance and recording, emphasizing immediacy over technical refinement. Demolition became their most iconic track, capturing this aesthetic in its purest form, sound and innovation. The song is built around a simple, repetitive guitar riff, driving rhythm and shouted vocals that border on chaotic expression. Its structure is minimal and direct, with little variation or development, focusing instead on intensity and momentum. The lyrical content, centered on destruction and rebellion, reinforces the abrasive sonic character. In retrospect, the recording anticipates elements that would later become central to punk rock and garage punk, even though it predates those movements by a decade. Legacy. Demolition has gained cult status over time, being rediscovered by collectors, musicians, and historians of rock music. Los Circus are now frequently cited as one of the most important proto-punk acts outside the United States and United Kingdom. The song remains a reference point for discussions about early global punk aesthetics and the emergence of raw, minimal rock expression. These choices are my own. I tried to avoid the obvious ones like Revolution Number 9 or 433 by John Cage. This is just the beginning. More parts are coming later. Thank you for watching, share, subscribe, and if you think it's worth it, consider becoming a member. I'm planning a lot of new things for the channel over the next few months. Just wait until the World Cup is over. Stay weird.